Bart Mania is sweeping through Springfield. It's the battle of the Season 5 classics, Bart's Inner Child versus Bart Gets Famous. It's a question of whether we should be like the boy, or instead proclaim that I didn't do it. It's also the battle of box factories and trampolines. Both are fun episodes, but we can only choose one. Which is the better episode? I think this specific showdown was kind of inevitable. They made two Bart-centric stories right smack in the middle of Season 5, with only 4 episodes separating them. They're stories about Bart suddenly becoming the most famous personality in Springfield. It's hard not to think of these two as a pair. Of course, he becomes famous for dramatically different reasons, so therein lies the debate. Do we like the more psychological bent of Bart's Inner Child, or do we prefer the examination of stardom in Bart Gets Famous? As always, we'll start with the episode that aired first. Just barely, it was like 3 months earlier. This is the case for Bart's Inner Child. Okay, so this is a showdown all about Bart's personality taking over Springfield. That's one of the main things these two shows have in common. Now, I don't want to drag the other episode through the mud right away, but why would you pick that one when it barely has anything to do with Bart's personality? Bart's Inner Child is superior because it's way more character-driven. This is always going to be somewhat true, since it focuses on the self-help industry. There is always going to be that character focus. The seminar during Act 2 serves as a nice spotlight for a lot of our secondary characters. Love these Moe and Skinner moments in particular. Then, everything that happens afterwards is a reaction to Bart's character. It's not just some dumb catchphrase that changes things. We get that before and after with a lot of these characters. I think that's really important for this kind of story. It's fun seeing what personal rebellion would look like for all these folks. But most importantly, from a storytelling perspective, we get a more credible character crisis for Bart. It becomes a real examination of the contrarian aspect of Bart's personality. How does one really stick it to the man when the man is already copying everything you're doing? There's a distinct lack of gimmick to Bart's Inner Child that is really appealing. Yeah, we have the trambopoline thing at the beginning, but even that's driven by Homer's characteristic stupidity. I totally buy the fact that he and Marge would have these kind of arguments about his schemes. It's a well-rounded exploration of these character quirks of the family we all know so well. This leads into my second point. Wow, look at that segue. Bart's Inner Child is superior because it uses the entire Simpson family better. Part of being such a character-driven episode means that they're able to organically incorporate the family into the plot. Really, this thing isn't even about Bart until about halfway through, when they drag him to the seminar. We start with fun, silly Homer stuff, get introspective about their marriage, then pivot toward emulating Bart. That's also when Lisa gets a chance to shine. I love her deadpan reaction of, "What?" to Brad Goodman's pitch. Then she gets to come back and help contextualize Bart's crisis of character. These characters tend to work best as a family ensemble. And watching these two back to back, it's pretty shocking how much Bart's Inner Child handles this better. In the other episode, Homer and Lisa barely have anything to do. Lisa is, unfortunately, used to taking the backseat sometimes in these Bart stories, but watching Homer make random jokes, desperately trying to make himself relevant, is kinda sad. The plot of Bart's Inner Child was built in a way to take advantage of these heavy-hitting characters. It just puts them in better situations. Yet somehow, even with all this family stuff, Bart's Inner Child somehow feels bigger and more satirical than the other episode. The other episode satirizes the entertainment industry, a very specific kind of work, whereas this one focuses on a way of life, something that really affects the entire town. I think we've all run across this kind of charlatan on television before, this kind of person who claims to know all the answers. Brad Goodman is a nice, laser-focused takedown on this kind of personality. They don't go the monorail route either, and make it all about his business operations. They treat the satire more like a reactive agent, instead letting us bask in the joy of complete chaos and mayhem. Springfield is at its best when devolving into an angry mob, something this episode understands perfectly. This chaos even provides the superior celebrity quote, with James Brown's classic, "This bandstand wasn't double bolted." Doesn't seem that great when I say it, but oh my god, his delivery. It is so great, so applicable to everything ever. This video wasn't double bolted. And with that unprecedented fourth reason why, I'm going to end this argument right here. Bart's Inner Child is the better Bart episode. Now make sure to hold on to your priceless Ming vases, because we're about to knock them over. This is the case for Bart Gets Famous. So you notice how that other guy barely mentioned the first act of his episode? Oh yeah, that trampoline was fun, I guess. Look, it's a Roadrunner parody. Cute. Well, I got two words for you. Box Factory. Bart Gets Famous is superior because it has a better first act. The Box Factory is an absolute classic opening set piece. It just kills all the way through. Some exceptional character acting here in particular, between the monotonous tour guide, the bored students, and Skinner and Martin's ridiculous excitement. I really like how Mrs. Krabappel and Bart are totally on the same page here, totally aligned in how mind-numbingly stupid this whole thing is. In addition, the Box Factory serves as a solid foundation for the story that follows it. We need something to establish Bart's general disinterest in his regular world. We desperately need that contrast. I think it creates a more interesting, be careful what you wish for aspect for Bart. While he certainly feels that in the other episode, there isn't actually any setup for that arc. The trampoline storyline has almost nothing to do with anything that comes after it. That story is much more linear. Whereas the plot of Bart Gets Famous is more well-rounded. They even call back to the Box Factory at the very end of the journey. Sure, this set piece is very funny, but ends up being central to the thesis of the episode. Secondly, Bart Gets Famous is superior because its secondary characters hit way harder. Sure, the other episode gets quote-unquote bigger and incorporates more people, but I would argue that it spreads itself too thin. When Bart Gets Famous brings in a secondary character, they really give them interesting stuff to do. We talked about the Mrs. Krabappel and Skinner stuff already, obviously, but this is a really strong Krusty episode too. We get a close look at the operations of his show, the way he treats his staff, his general view on show business. The episode capitalizes on Krusty's jadedness, how he's kind of seen everything in this industry, despite not fully understanding it. With the rest of Springfield, they treat us to a lot of shallow peek-ins to these characters. But I would argue that these are a little more fun than the other episode's examples. They either play with Bart's catchphrase, or show off how their relationship with Bart has changed. Sure, I'll admit that the Simpson family have less to do, but that's the nature of the story. If we're doing a story about Bart's stardom, the important thing is to convey how the outside world is affecting him. Third, Bart Gets Famous is better because it is more meta and self-aware. This is the episode that is more aware of its place in the series' history, what came before it, and what it had become. It was a couple years removed from the Bartmania craze of eat my shorts, don't have a cow, and for some reason, cowabunga. Picking this kind of story for Bart is pretty slick. They can comment on this phenomenon that the show went through, comment on the dilemma of giving the crowd what they want versus showing them something new. However, it doesn't come off as something like the Poochie episode, for example. It's still focused, more or less, on Bart's character arc going through that entertainment machine. They add a nice layer of meta-humor to the whole journey without it becoming too overbearing. And finally, contrary to what you heard a couple minutes ago, Bart Gets Famous is actually the episode with the better celebrity quote. You know what it is. It's really quick, but oh so memorable. James Brown may have been the godfather of soul, but on The Simpsons, only Conan may dance. Also, these characters can dance too. But whatever. Bart Gets Famous is still better. Let's go to the verdict. This is a really weird showdown in that I went into it feeling pretty confident about which one is better. But upon my 3 rewatches, it gave me quite a bit of pause. On the one hand, Bart's Inner Child runs into some issues with its first half. I enjoy the trampoline opener for sure, but it transitions so incredibly poorly into the real plot. If this were made today, we'd all definitely complain about this handoff. Also, Act 2 can drag a bit with the Brad Goodman seminar. His speech goes on way too long, and his performance doesn't have enough energy to push through it. I think what Bart's Inner Child has going for it is its momentum going into its final act. The character conflict builds and builds and builds to a much more interesting place. Bart Gets Famous has a stronger foundation up front, is a significantly more focused episode, but it's a little like the dog chasing the truck. Once Bart catches the truck and becomes famous, the episode doesn't quite know what to do with it. It just goes for cutaway after cutaway. There's little to no introspection, or even plot here. Bart gets super depressed, and then it pivots almost immediately back to him accepting his role. What was the point of all this? It's like they couldn't efficiently rectify Bart's issues within their time limit, so they just went for the arch meta joke. Funny moment, but kinda lame as an actual resolution. I would say Bart Gets Famous has the slightly more complete character arc, but is much more shallow than the other episode. But enough nitpicking, let's pick one of these already. So, if I had to pick only one of these episodes, I think I would go with Bart Gets Famous. I had just complained about the second half of it feeling pretty aimless, but I do have to give it credit for being very funny. The humor of this stuff tends to cover up some of that aimlessness. It's a shame that Homer and Lisa couldn't find anything to do, but at the very least, it does give Bart an entire character arc journey to travel through. This is a really nice ending, a very poignant way to wrap things up. I tend to err on the side of a story being too laser focused, rather than being too all over the place. Bart's Inner Child just takes too long to get going for my taste. Doesn't seem to know what it's about until halfway through. They even had to resort to old clips of Marge nagging to get things moving. I think if Brad Goodman absolutely killed it with his jokes, it would be less noticeable. But there's a reason why people don't mention this guy first when listing Albert Brooks' best characters. He's not bad or anything, don't get me wrong, he's just okay. So that's ultimately where I landed. Bart Gets Famous is the superior episode. But as always, I'm curious what all of you think of these two episodes. Did I get this one right, or will this decision send us all into a shame spiral? Let me know in the comments. But for now, this case is closed.